In the autumn of 1887, along a spur line that had not carried revenue freight in 11 years, there sat a locomotive that men had given up on before they had fairly begun to try. It was a Baldwin 10-wheeler, built in 1871 for the Central Wyoming and Prairie Rail Company, and it had earned its keep for 9 years, hauling coal, cattle, and dry goods across the grasslands between Rawlins and the mountain camps. Then the company folded, as so many did in those years of overextension and borrowed capital, and the locomotive was left on a stub of track at the edge of a field outside the town of Grover Station, Wyoming Territory, because no one could agree on who owned it, and because no man who climbed into the cab and attempted to fire her up had ever gotten anything out of her but cold iron and silence. The boiler was intact. The drive wheels were sound. The firebox passed a visual inspection by 2 different machinists who each declared with some frustration that they could see no reason the engine should not run. She simply did not. By 1887, the locomotive had sat in that field for 11 years. The grass had grown up around her wheels. Rust had wept down her flanks in orange and umber streaks, painting the dark iron in the colors of autumn. Children climbed on her and jumped off, and the men who passed her on the road gave her the kind of tolerant glance reserved for local fixtures and old embarrassments. Her name was still readable on the running board, though barely. Someone had painted it there in 1871 in white letters that time had reduced to a faint suggestion. The name was Constance. Winifred Crane arrived in Grover Station on the 14th of October, 1887, carrying a canvas bag, a set of tools wrapped in oilcloth, and $41, which was the remainder of what she had earned in 3 years of working a roundhouse in Cheyenne. She was 27 years old. She had a steady way of looking at things that people sometimes mistook for arrogance and sometimes for patience, and she did not much trouble herself with which impression she left. She had come because of a letter, not addressed to her precisely, but passed through her hands by a former colleague who had thought she might have use for it. The letter was 2 pages, written in a tight mechanical hand, and it described the Baldwin 10-wheeler outside Grover Station in some detail, including the fact that the Central Wyoming and Prairie Rail Company had never formally transferred title to any party, that the Territorial Records Office still listed the locomotive under the company's liquidation estate, and that a buyer presenting adequate documentation and a nominal sum might be able to claim her outright. Winifred had read that letter 6 times on the train from Cheyenne. If you have ever known someone who looked at a broken thing and felt not discouragement but curiosity, a sharpening of attention rather than a turning away, then you have some sense of what she felt standing in that field on an October morning, looking up at the Constance for the first time. If you have known someone like that, you know they are rare, and you know they are worth watching. She walked around the locomotive twice before she touched it. She noted the condition of the drive rods, the state of the piston housings, the rust pattern on the tender. She crouched and looked under the cab. She climbed the step and opened the firebox door and looked inside. Then she climbed back down and stood in the grass and looked at the coal tender, which rode behind the cab on its own set of wheels, and she did not look away from it for a long time. The tender was a steel box, 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, mounted on a pair of 2-axle trucks. It was meant to carry coal and water for the engine. The rear section held a water tank, and the front section was the coal bunker, open at the top. 11 years of rain and sun had left a thin crust of old coal dust on the forward floor of the bunker, mixed with rust scale and bird droppings, and a scatter of dry grass that had blown in over the years. To any man who had looked into it, which was several, it had looked like an empty bin with a dirty floor. Nothing more. Winifred looked at the floor of the coal bunker and saw that it was not quite level. It was a small thing, The variation was perhaps 3/4 of an inch across the width of the bunker, a slight cant toward the left side. In a box that size on an old locomotive, one might attribute it to years of settling, to bent frame members, to any number of ordinary mechanical deformations that accumulated in iron machinery left outdoors for a decade. Any reasonable man would have attributed it to that. Winifred Crane had spent 3 years in a Cheyenne roundhouse learning mechanical inspection from a man named Harlan Dodd, who had spent 30 years before that as a boilermaker and locomotive fitter for 3 different railways in Ohio and Missouri before his wife's family pulled him west. He was a compact, deliberate man who spoke in plain declarative sentences and who believed that a person's hands were the only reliable instrument they had, provided the person in question had been taught to use them correctly. He had taught Winifred. She had been 19 when she arrived at the Cheyenne roundhouse, sent there by a cousin who worked the locomotive cleaning crews, and who had mentioned without much hope that the head fitter was known to take on apprentices who showed a particular kind of attention. Harlan Dodd had made her spend the first 2 weeks doing nothing but cleaning tools and naming their parts. He had not spoken to her directly during that period, except to correct errors. On the 15th day, he had handed her a flange gauge and told her to check the wheel, set on number 43, and when she had done so accurately and completely, he had said, without ceremony, that she could stay. She had stayed for 3 years. Harlan Dodd was dead now, of a chest ailment that took him in the winter of 1885, and Winifred carried his tools and his way of looking at metal things, which was to say never a tribute to settling what precision measurement could explain. She borrowed a leveling instrument from the hardware merchant in Grover Station, a man named Pruitt, who lent it with the mild skepticism of a person who has been asked for unusual things before and expects them to come to nothing. He watched her carry it out of his store without a word, and she was grateful for the absence of comment. She measured the bunker floor in a grid pattern, marking each point on the steel with a piece of chalk. She did this over the course of an afternoon while a small assembly of townspeople observed from a respectful distance, offering occasional commentary that she did not acknowledge. One man called out that she was wasting her time on a dead engine. Another said something she did not catch that made the others laugh. A third, older, said nothing at all but stood apart from the rest with his arms crossed and watched her with a different quality of attention. She marked 47 points across the bunker floor, working in rows, and she recorded each measurement in her logbook. When she was done, she sat on the rail and read through the measurements, and the pattern was plain. She had been hoping it would not be plain. When a thing is plain, it means the work is only beginning. The floor of the coal bunker was not bent or settled. It was a false floor. Someone had built a second steel deck inside the original bunker, set on concealed brackets, leaving a cavity beneath it. And they had laid the original coal residue on top of the false floor with sufficient care that 11 years of abandonment had distributed enough weather debris over it to make the construction invisible to casual inspection. The false floor was 3/8 of an inch of steel plate. The cavity beneath it was 8 inches deep, running the full 12-foot length of the bunker, roughly 4 feet wide. That cavity she had not yet opened. She claimed the locomotive the following morning. The Territorial Land Office was in Rawlins, 22 miles east, and Winifred made the journey by wagon, carrying the letter and her own written summary of the estate records she had verified the previous evening at the county recorder's office, where a clerk named Mabry had looked at her with a particular brand of exhausted surprise that she recognized as the expression men produced when a woman asked a direct bureaucratic question without apologizing for it. Mabry had found the estate filing after 20 minutes of search, during which he had twice commented that the company had been dissolved 11 years prior, and the records would be minimal, as though warning her not to expect anything useful. She had thanked him each time without agreeing with him, and in the end the filing had been exactly where the estate index said it would be, and the locomotive's title had been exactly as unresolved as the letter described. She paid $17 for the formal transfer of title, which left her $24 and some change, and she signed the document in a clear, unhurried hand. The land office clerk had folded the paper and stamped it with a resigned efficiency that suggested he had no particular opinion about who owned old locomotives and expected the matter would come to nothing either way. She drove back to Grover Station in the afternoon, stopped at Pruitt's Hardware, and bought a cold chisel, a short pry bar, a ball-peen hammer, and a second-hand carbide lamp. Pruitt watched her lay these items on the counter without comment for a moment and then said, carefully, that folks around town had been talking about what she was doing out at the locomotive. Winifred said she expected they had. Pruitt said that 2 men from the Rawlins Commercial Bank had come through Grover Station in September, before she arrived, looking at the locomotive. He said they had hired a mechanic from Laramie to inspect it, and the mechanic had spent 1 day on it and declared it unrestorable and departed, and the bankman had departed shortly after. Winifred said she had seen the mechanic's report, or a copy of it, in the territorial records. She said the mechanic had inspected the boiler and the drive gear and the cab fittings and had not inspected the tender. Pruitt looked at the chisel and the pry bar for a moment. He said that seemed like an odd thing to overlook. Winifred said most things people overlooked seemed odd, once you knew they had overlooked them. She paid for the tools and left. There are different kinds of labor, and not all of them are loud. Some work announces itself with the ring of hammer on stone, the groan of timbers, the visible sweat of men hauling. The work she performed in the coal bunker of the Constance over the next 2 days was quiet work, precise work, the kind that leaves the hands sore in the small muscles and the eyes dry from concentration. She worked by the carbide lamp, kneeling in the residue on the false floor, using the cold chisel to locate the edges of the steel plate by feel and sound, tapping at intervals until the note changed from the dull report of solid backing to the slightly hollow ring that indicated open space beneath. The hollow ring was faint, and she had to clear the area of debris before each tap to hear it cleanly, and then clear another area and tap again. The October cold in the bunker was considerable. The steel held the cold differently than stone or wood held it, a specific damp chill that found its way through her coat and her gloves and settled in the joints of her fingers. She paused twice in the first 2 hours to rub her hands together over the carbide lamp, close enough to feel the warmth without burning the skin, the way Harlan Dodd had taught her to do when the cold stiffened the hands too far for fine work. You could not do fine work with stiff hands. You could not do anything well with stiff hands. She found 5 bracket mounts, spaced at roughly 2-foot intervals along the near side of the bunker. Each bracket had been spot welded to the interior wall of the tender, and then to the false floor plate, a competent if hasty job, done by someone who knew what they were doing but was working under some constraint of time or visibility. Harlan Dodd had taught her to read weld work the way a reader reads handwriting. The bead told you something about the hand that laid it, and about the conditions under which the work was done. These welds had been laid by a skilled hand, quickly, in poor light. She cut the first bracket on the afternoon of the first day. The chisel work was slow because the steel was good quality plate, and the welds were solid, and because she was working in a confined space with limited room for a mallet swing. The sound of metal on metal in the enclosed bunker was sharp and clear, and it drew a few of the townspeople back to the field in the late afternoon, where they stood in the cooling light and watched the occasional small shower of rust scale drift down from the side of the tender. By the time the light began to fail, she had cut 2 of the 5 brackets, and her right arm ached from the elbow to the wrist, a deep ache in the forearm that she recognized and respected. She climbed out of the bunker, ate the bread and salt pork she had brought, and slept in the cab, wrapped in her wool coat and the red shawl her aunt had knitted for her the winter before, which was thick enough to serve as a blanket in the October cold of Wyoming territory. She was back in the bunker at first light. The second bracket fell on the morning of the second day, and the third by noon. She stopped twice to rest her arm and once to refill the carbide lamp. Around her, at varying distances, the life of Grover Station proceeded with the mild curiosity that small towns extend to unusual projects. Pruitt's boy came out in the morning and sat on the rail and watched without speaking. An older man named Foss, who had been a section hand on the Central Wyoming line before the company failed, appeared at midday and stood at the edge of the field for a long time, with his hands in his coat pockets. When Winifred climbed out to rest her arm, she saw him there and nodded to him when he came a little closer. He said he had been the section foreman on this spur line for the last 4 years the company ran it. He said the locomotive had been put on this siding in the spring of 1876, and he had wondered ever since why it had not been moved during the final liquidation. He said he had looked at it himself a few times years back, because it seemed to him there should have been more to the liquidation than there was, more equipment accounted for. Winifred said that was an interesting way to put it. Foss said the company president, a man named Aldous Kimber, had managed the liquidation proceedings himself in 1876, and that the final settlement had seemed thin to a number of people, though nobody had been able to say exactly where the thinness was. He said Kimber had moved to Denver afterward and done well for himself in land speculation, which some people had found noteworthy and others had found merely convenient. Winifred was quiet for a moment. She looked at her chalk marks on the side of the tender. Then she said that she would like Foss to be present when she opened the cavity, if he was willing to stay. Foss said he had nowhere pressing to be. She cut the 4th and 5th brackets in the early afternoon of the second day. The false floor plate was now held in place only by its own weight and the residue that had accumulated on its surface. She used the short pry bar to break the seal of rust and debris along the forward edge, working the bar at 3 points until she felt the plate shift. She got both hands under the edge and lifted. The plate was heavy, perhaps 80 pounds, and she moved it 6 inches before her grip failed. She rested, reset her hands, and lifted again. This time, Foss climbed up the side of the tender without being asked and took the opposite edge of the plate, and together they lifted it clear and set it aside on the bunker floor. What was under it had been sealed from air and weather for 11 years. The cold came up first, a breath of preserved darkness, carrying the smell of coal dust and oil and old paper. It was the smell of a thing sealed against time, and it was unmistakable to anyone who had worked around machinery long enough to know what cold iron smelled like when it had been shut away from the seasons. The cavity was 8 inches deep, as she had estimated, running the full length and width of the bunker. The floor of the true cavity was lined with oilcloth, laid in overlapping sheets and sealed at the edges with a pine tar compound that had kept the moisture out with some success, though not perfectly. At the near corner where the false floor brackets had allowed the slightest gap, there was a thin crescent of rust stain on the oilcloth and a small deposit of dried silt, the record of 11 autumns of rain finding its way through the only weakness in the construction. It was a small failure. The man who built this had been careful. The oilcloth beneath the stain was still sound. On the oilcloth, in the light of the carbide lamp, lay a flat steel strongbox, roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, padlocked, its surface filmed with a fine gray dust that had settled through the seams of the false floor over 11 years. The dust was even and undisturbed. No one had been in this cavity since the day it was sealed. and the dust said so plainly. Beside the strong box, wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth and bound with wire, was a rectangular bundle roughly the size of a ledger book. And at the far end of the cavity, wedged against the forward bulkhead of the tender, were 4 canvas bags, each one closed with a drawstring and sealed with a wax stamp. Foss said nothing for a long time. The two of them knelt at the edge of the cavity and looked down into it, and the only sound was the wind coming across the field and the distant crow of a rooster somewhere in the town. Then Foss said very quietly that he had known there was more. The padlock on the strong box had a keyway she recognized. It was a Scandinavian pattern lever lock, the same type used on railway cash boxes in the 1870s, and Harlan Dodd had shown her once how to open one without the key, using a pair of thin probes worked in sequence against the levers. It had taken her 3 attempts then, and it took her 4 attempts now, kneeling in the cold of the coal bunker with her cold chisel set aside and the probes in her hands, working by feel in the light of the carbide lamp, while Foss sat on the rim of the bunker and waited with the patience of a man who has waited for things before. The lock released on the 4th attempt with a sound that was barely audible over the wind. Inside the strong box were documents, not cash, not coin, documents. 37 pages of paper, dry and brittle at the edges but legible throughout, written in 2 different hands. The first hand was the tight mechanical script she had seen before, in the letter that had reached her in Cheyenne. The second hand was a looser, larger cursive, annotated in the margins in pencil. She did not read them in the field. She closed the strongbox, relocked it, and sat for a time with her hands on her knees. The oilcloth bundle contained a ledger. It was the Central Wyoming and Prairie Rail Company's freight revenue ledger for the years 1873 through 1876, the final 3 years of the company's operation. She recognized what she was looking at immediately. It was a secondary ledger kept alongside whatever primary book had been submitted to the company's creditors and the territorial courts during the liquidation. A second set of numbers recording the freight revenues that had not appeared in the official accounting. The canvas bags contained coin. She counted it later in Pruitt's back room with Pruitt and Foss present and the door closed. The total was $4,260 in silver coin, along with a collection of gold certificates totaling an additional $1,100 issued by a Denver bank in 1875. She did not touch the documents or the coin that night. She closed the cavity, replaced the false floor plate as well as she could without the brackets, and walked back into Grover Station in the dark. She ate at the boarding house without tasting much of what she ate, and sat for an hour afterward at the table in her room, reading the 37 pages of documents by lamplight. The lamp was a small one, and she had to hold the pages close to make out the marginalia in pencil, which were faint and cramped, as though written in haste or in poor light. By the end of the hour, she understood what Aldous Kimber had done. She understood the shape of it clearly, the way you understand a mechanism clearly, once you have found the part that was wrong. The company had operated in its last 3 years as a going concern to the world, while running a private skimming operation, visible only in the secondary books, and those books had not gone into any filing cabinet or safe that could be subpoenaed. They had gone into the coal tender of a locomotive that Kimber had maneuvered into an estate limbo, a piece of rolling stock that technically belonged to nobody, that nobody had reason to look at carefully, that anyone who did look at would find cold and silent and not worth the trouble. The perfect concealment, provided no one looked at the floor of the coal bunker with a level and a systematic mind. Kimber had trusted, as most men in his position trusted, that the world contained very few people who would look that carefully at a thing they had already decided was worthless. The Central Wyoming and Prairie Rail Company had collected freight revenue in the final 3 years of its operation that it had never reported to its creditors or to the court overseeing the liquidation. The secondary ledger showed collections totaling just over $18,000 across those 3 years, all of it received in cash, none of it appearing in the official books. The 37 documents were Kimber's own records, kept, she could only speculate, as insurance against his own subordinates, a private accounting of where the money had gone and who had received what share of it. 3 names appeared in the distribution records besides Kimber's own. 2 of them she did not recognize. The third was a name she had seen on a territorial land office document that afternoon. The clerk who had processed the company's liquidation filing in 1876 was named Hargreave, and Hargreave's name appeared in the distribution records for a sum of $900, listed as a fee for services rendered in the matter of the estate settlement. The freight company's creditors had received 23 cents on the dollar in the liquidation of 1876. Among those creditors were 31 individual freight customers, small ranch operations and supply merchants, and 1 sheep farming family named Brandt, who had prepaid freight contracts that had never been honored and who had received nothing in the settlement. She sat with that for a time. Then she wrote a letter. It was addressed to the Territorial Attorney General's office in Cheyenne, and it was 3 pages long, precise and specific, citing the documents by page and content. She described the location of the evidence, the method of concealment, the dimensions of the false floor, and the nature of the secondary ledger. She did not editorialize. She did not describe her feelings about what she had read or what she thought ought to happen next. She named Kimber and named Hargreave and named the distribution figures and cited the page of the secondary ledger on which each figure appeared. She asked that the office contact her at the Grover Station boarding house within 10 days and indicated that she would present the evidence to any appropriate authority they chose to send. She sealed the letter and went to bed. If you have ever watched someone do something that ought to have been done years ago, and do it quietly, without ceremony, you know there is a particular quality to that moment, a strange kind of stillness around the action. The letter went out on the morning mail wagon without fanfare, tucked among the other outgoing correspondence, indistinguishable from it except for the address. Winifred slept 7 hours that night and woke to a cold, clear morning and ate breakfast at the boarding house table across from a cattle buyer who was reading a newspaper and who did not look up. And then she went out to work on the Locomotive. She spent the following days working on the Constance. She had $17 remaining and she spent 9 of it on boiler compound, rust-cutting oil, and a length of new gasket material from a supply house in Rawlins reached by mail order. She cleaned the firebox thoroughly, scraping the crown sheet and the side walls and the grate bars, working in a crouch with rags and a wire brush until the iron showed clean beneath the scale. She worked over the steam dome fittings and replaced 2 gaskets that had hardened to uselessness, prying them free with a thin-bladed tool and pressing the new ones into place with her thumb. She oiled every joint in the running gear she could reach with the tools she had, working through the eccentric rods and the valve gear linkages, each joint given its due before moving to the next. She did not hurry any of it. She did not know yet what she would do with the Locomotive, whether she could find a buyer for a restored 10-wheeler, or whether there was some other use she could make of the claim. She worked on the Locomotive because the work needed doing, and because doing it was the right use of her hands while she waited. Foss came out each afternoon and sat on the running board and occasionally handed her a tool or held the lamp while she worked in a confined space. He was a patient man, unhurried in the way of people who have spent long years working the length of a rail line and learned the economy of motion that outdoor labor teaches. He did not talk much, but when he did talk, he was useful. He told her that the Brandt family still ranched southeast of Grover Station, about 12 miles out, a sheep and cattle operation that had been in the family since the early 1870s. He told her that old Enos Brandt had died in 1879, 3 years after the freight company failed and the settlement came through, and that his daughter Clara ran the ranch now with her husband and 2 of her brothers. He said the Brandts had been owed $800 in the freight settlement and had received a little under $200, and that Enos Brandt had died believing the company had simply been poorly managed and the money lost honestly. He said there had been others who thought the same. He named 2 of them, a seed merchant and a cattle drover, both of whom had accepted their thin settlement shares and moved on without raising any formal complaint, because raising a formal complaint about a bankrupt company's liquidation required a lawyer and time and money and a belief that the complaint would be heard, and none of the small creditors had all 4 of those things at once. Kimber had understood that. The administrative maze of the liquidation proceeding was the armor he had worn while he settled the accounts in his own favor. Winifred cleaned the crown sheet of the firebox and thought about that. The Territorial Attorney General's office responded in 9 days. 2 men came, a deputy attorney named Colby, young and precise and clearly uncertain what to make of the situation, and a senior investigator named Marsh who was older, quieter, and who said very little as she showed him the documents and the ledger and the coin in Pruitt's back room. Marsh read the 37 pages with the unhurried concentration of a man who has read documents of this kind before. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at her without expression and asked 2 questions, both technical, about the padlock and about how she had identified the false floor. She answered both questions and he nodded. He said the Attorney General's office would convene a review of the 1876 liquidation proceedings. He said it would take some months. He said the coin and the documents would need to go with him as evidence, and she said she had expected as much and had made an inventory of everything, witnessed by Pruitt and Foss and signed by all 3 of them. Marsh looked at the inventory and said it was thorough. She did not ask him what would happen to Kimber. She assumed he would know better than she did what could be done at 11 years' remove, and she did not want to be told something she could not change. She wanted the record corrected and the creditors notified, and those things were in motion. Aldous Kimber was 63 years old and living in Denver when the Attorney General's office contacted him. He had been a moderately prominent man in Denver land circles for a decade by that time, known for a certain quality of aggressive competence in contract negotiation and for the kind of civic philanthropy that men in his position practiced carefully, the gift that announced itself so that the giver's name was remembered. He had a house on the better side of the city and a seat on 2 boards of commercial directors and a reputation for reliability that he had built with some deliberateness in the years since the Wyoming Railway venture. He retained a lawyer and issued a denial. The denial was answered by the secondary ledger, in which his own hand appeared on 31 pages of distribution records, numbers written in the same tight mechanical script she had recognized from the letter. He had apparently trusted the concealment to hold. He had not imagined the coal tender would be opened by anyone, much less by a 27-year-old woman from a Cheyenne roundhouse with a chalk marking system and a borrowed level. The proceedings took 14 months. Kimber settled for a substantial sum and was barred from holding any territorial or corporate office. His name disappeared from the Denver board seats quietly, without public comment, which was the way these things tended to go. Hargreave had died in 1883, which simplified that portion of the matter. The funds from the settlement were distributed to the original creditors' estates, with interest calculated from 1876. The territorial court appointed an administrator to locate the surviving parties or their heirs. Clara Brandt drove into Grover Station on a Tuesday morning in March of 1889 to speak with the administrator and was told in formal language the amount her family was owed and the process by which it would be paid. She sat for a moment with that information and then asked the administrator who had found the secondary ledger. The administrator told her, Clara Brandt found Winifred at the Locomotive, which was in considerably better condition than it had been 18 months earlier. The boiler had been tested and certified by a railway inspector from Cheyenne. The running gear had been cleaned and oiled, and one cracked eccentric strap had been replaced. The cab fittings were in working order. The locomotive was not yet operational because the cost of fuel and the matter of connecting her to a working section of track remained unresolved. But the rust no longer wept from her flanks, and the firebox was clean, and the white letters of her name on the running board had been repainted in the previous autumn by Winifred and Pruitt's boy on a Saturday afternoon when there was nothing else pressing. Clara Brandt was 32 years old and direct in the way of people who have run a ranch for a decade without excess time for ceremony. She stood in the field and looked at the locomotive and then looked at Winifred, who had climbed down from the cab when she saw the wagon coming. Clara said that she had come to say thank you. Winifred said she was glad the matter had been resolved. Clara said that her father had gone to his grave thinking the company had simply failed and the money been lost, and that this had sat poorly with her family for 13 years. Winifred said she understood that. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said she supposed Winifred had found other things in that bunker besides the ledger. Winifred said she had. She said the full accounting was in the court record. Clara nodded. She looked at the locomotive again and asked what Winifred intended to do with it. Winifred said she had a buyer in Rawlins, a small freight cooperative that had been organized 2 years previous and needed rolling stock, and that the negotiations were proceeding. She said she expected to have the locomotive on operable track within the year. Clara looked at the running board and the repainted name there. She said it seemed right that someone had gotten the locomotive running again, and that it should be someone who knew how to look at the thing properly. She drove back to her ranch. Winifred watched the wagon until it cleared the edge of the field, and then she turned back to the locomotive. There was one more thing she wanted to check before she was satisfied. The steam pressure gauge in the cab had what she suspected was a hairline crack in the glass face that she had not been able to confirm without a direct test. She climbed the step and opened the cab door and reached past the fireman's seat to the gauge housing, and she held the carbide lamp close and looked. The crack was there, small and diagonal, running from the 8-pound mark to the 12. She would need a replacement gauge glass before the boiler could be formally tested under pressure. She made a note in her small logbook, the one Harlan Dodd had given her in the second year of her apprenticeship, its cover worn and its pages dense with measurements and observations in the two hands, his and hers, the older entries in his careful cursive and the newer ones in her own close print. She wrote down the gauge glass dimensions and the supplier she would contact in Cheyenne. She dated the entry. The morning light came through the cab windows at a low angle, the particular clear light of a Wyoming spring, and it caught the brass fittings of the pressure panel and the worn wooden handles of the throttle and brake, and it fell across the open page of the logbook, and it was, in its quiet way, sufficient. Harlan Dodd had told her once, in the roundhouse in Cheyenne on a cold afternoon, when she was struggling with a valve seat that refused to seat properly, that most mechanical problems were not mysterious once you agreed to look at them long enough. He had said that the machine always told you what was wrong if you were willing to hear it. He had said that most people were not willing because listening to a machine required patience, and patience required the belief that the truth was in there waiting, and that belief was harder to sustain than most people admitted. She had thought about that often in the 11 months since she had first stood in the field outside Grover Station and looked at the coal tender, and she thought about it now, her pencil resting in the logbook, the spring light moving slowly across the cab. She closed the logbook and set it in her bag with the tools. Below, the field was greening again at the edges where the grass was coming back. The Constance stood in the morning light, her drive wheels solid on the rail, her boiler cleaned and certified and ready, waiting for the section of track that would connect her to the world again. Waiting was a thing the Locomotive had learned to do well, over 11 years. She thought that patience, in iron as in people, was a form of stubbornness about the future, a refusal to accept that the present condition was final. She climbed down from the cab, picked up her bag, and walked back toward town to send her letter to the gauge glass supplier in Cheyenne. If a story like this one finds you wondering what else has gone unlooked at, what else is waiting to be heard, leave a word below. There are others. In the spring of 1890, the Constance made her first run under her new operators, the Rawlins Freight Cooperative, pulling a mixed load of dry goods and fencing wire from Rawlins to the mountain camps along what had once been the central Wyoming spur. She moved well. She ran true.